I'd like to start by talking a little bit about how, or why, rather, Amra and I decided to put together this anthology, Coming of Age, Growing Up Muslim in Australia. I guess it all started way back when. For Amra and I, growing up was a mix of questions. Were we defined by our cultures, our faith, what we ate at home? What part of us was Australian? How much of us was Bosnian or Turkish? We watched mainstream Australia take shape in our lounge rooms. We laughed at a pink ostrich on Saturday nights. We fell in love on the sandy shores of Summer Bay. We were drawn to the mystery and drama of Neighbours that familiarised us with Anglo-Australia but placed us on the sidelines. The lives on television, at school, in books, were very different to the lives that we lived at home. We had no way of mediating our dual identities, no thread that connected our two worlds, no books to reassure us that we weren't alone, that there were Aussie Lebanese, Aussie Pakistanis, Aussie Serbians who were balancing their identities too. As we grew up, the gaps in society grew wider. Stereotypes erected walls around us, boxing us and many others in. There were questions, assumptions, misconceptions, labels about our ethnic cultures, our Muslim faith. We were Wogs, Pakis, Turks, curry munchers, Arabs, Lebos, nappy heads, migrants. Post 9/11 changed perceptions in society and pigeonholed Australian Muslims who come from 70 different countries. There was no dialogue between mainstream Australia and minority ethnic and Muslim communities in literature, which widened the gap. We wanted to close it. We wanted to provide a mainstream platform for dialogue, to edit an anthology of real stories by Australian Muslims of diverse backgrounds, to give young people from all faiths and cultures tools to help them in their own journeys of reconciling their identities. We wanted contributors who challenged religious and cultural stereotypes, whose stories dealt with universal themes like finding their sexuality, overcoming bullying, familial and societal expectations, body image, and the forging of friendships. Coming of Age, Growing Up Muslim in Australia strips back the stereotypes to reveal honest, heartfelt, humorous stories about the complexities of growing up with ethnic and Muslim backgrounds and forging an identity in multicultural Australia. These stories crush the ethnic and Muslim tags to show the human experience that transcends labels. They highlight that just like any religion, Islam has various branches and its practices and interpretations are influenced by culture, ethnicity, nationality, education, and age. The process of gathering these stories was an enriching one. Contributors responded to our brief with ideas that over time leapt off the page and into our hearts. Stories of love, friendship, courage, loneliness, identity, and belonging. The human experience, raw, honest, and real. Here were other people's shoes to walk us through foreign yet familiar experiences, diverse perspectives that transform, enlighten, resonate, connect, and help bridge the gaps in our society. Thank you, and over to Amra.
Hi, so I'm Amra Pajalik. I'm Demet's co-editor, and I'm going to be talking about the contributors. So we have three of our contributors on the stage who will be talking to you soon. We've got Elena Muhammad Ali, Irfan Yusuf, and Tasneem Chopra. But I wanted to talk about the other 9 contributors that make up this anthology. So our contributors are from a variety of backgrounds and professions. They are politicians, celebrities, medical professionals, lawyers, editors, authors, professional athletes, artists, journalists, and a beauty queen. So first I'm going to talk about Randa Abdel Fattah, who's of Palestinian and Egyptian heritage, and in her piece, The Road to Self-Acceptance is Paved with Tim Tams, she recounts her dreams and fantasies as an overweight teenager hiding inside her hijab and her decision to no longer wear it. Michael Muhammad Ahmad is from a Lebanese family, and his piece on being Michael and Muhammad describes his experience as an Alawite Muslim amongst the Sunni majority in Lakemba. Tanveer Ahmad grew up in an immigrant Bangladeshi family in Sydney's West, and his piece, The Art of Bargaining, is at once a riff on the instinct for haggling and a reflection on the father-son relationship. Ali Alizadeh was born in Iran and migrated to Australia when he was 13. His piece, Leaving God, begins with him renouncing religion as an annoyingly precocious 10-year-old in Iran, his words, and going on to indulge in unnecessary swearing and blasphemy, excessive drinking, and premarital sex. Amal Awad's piece, The 5-Minute Engagement, is a humorous and heartfelt account of Muslim romance, the technicalities of courtship, the romantic expectations of the Western world, and the realities of her Arab heritage. Arwa al-Mazri is the daughter of Palestinian migrants, and her piece, Muslim Footprint, describes her arrival in Australia as a child migrant from Saudi Arabia and her struggle to find her place in multicultural society. Hazim al-Mazri, who also happens to be her husband, is a Lebanese-Australian former professional rugby league footballer, and in The Other Side he writes of the challenges of being a devout Muslim professional sportsman. Bianca Bam Bam Elmir is an Australian kickboxer, and in The Fighting Spirit she explores how training and fighting gave her an avenue to channel her frustrations about the constraint placed on her as a young Muslim woman. And Sabrina Husami is a former Miss World Australia and a member of Mensa. Her piece, Mishmash Muslim, is about reconciling her culturally and religiously diverse background and explores Muslim femininity beyond the Muslim stereotype. So as you can see, we have something for everyone. So I now take pleasure in introducing you to our first contributor who will be speaking tonight. So Elena Muhammad Ali is of Pakistani heritage. She has recently retrained as a primary school teacher, having been a lawyer in the not-for-profit sector for many years. Elena has been frequently published on disability, housing, health, human rights and anti-discrimination law, and regularly speaks on different issues at conferences, workshops and on air. She founded the Queer Muslims in Australia Yahoo group and has served many years on the Australian GLBTIQ Multicultural Council. Elena is in the process of authoring a cookbook on modern Australian cuisine with a Pakistani twist, and she lives in Melbourne with her partner, their 3-year-old son and a newborn. A cat completes her happy family. And she will now talk about her piece, People Like Me.
Thank you, Amra. Thank you, Dermot. Before I talk about my piece, I want to talk about how I actually came to be in the book. Now, as Amra mentioned, I identify as a queer Muslim woman, and I have spoken about my story many times in different environments. However, when Amra and Dermot came to me and said they want to talk about an experience of being Muslim in Australia, growing up here, and what it was like, and they wanted my voice because they'd heard that, yes, I was a queer Muslim woman and was out and proud, and so they thought that that would be really a rich contribution to the fact that, well, there are many Muslim kids out there who are struggling with their spirituality and sexuality, and for me to be included in that book would be great. And I jumped at the chance because, let's be honest, I mean, queer Muslim woman to many traditional, let's say, fundamentalist Muslim men is not particularly palatable. So when they said, no, we want your voice, I was very excited to work with them, and I just want to say thank you for including my voice. Thank you. Okay, so here's my story, and I've got 15 minutes to tell it, so quick. All right. And there's a timekeeper behind me as well. Well, we came to Australia, my parents and I, when I was about 3. My parents were skilled immigrants, so perhaps a slightly different story to many other people in that both were university educated. My father actually was working for a shipping company at the time, and we make so many jokes about this because the choice was either go off to Canada or go to Australia. So I could be speaking Canadian right now, maybe. But, well, he chose Australia. And we knew nothing about Australia in 1980. And we came here and we moved between Sydney and Melbourne over the next 7-odd years. And my younger sister was born, who, of course, is in the audience here today. And we lived here for that time and that period. And interestingly enough, my parents were quite young at that time. They were in their 20s themselves. And I grew up knowing I was Muslim, being raised as Muslim, going through the Anglican private schooling system, but still, yes, being Muslim. And being Muslim was not a point of fear in the 80s. It just wasn't. Amongst my friends, who were all blonde-haired and blue-eyed, well, it was just different, you know. I'd ask them, you know, why do you eat so much chocolate in April? And they'd say to me, well, why aren't you eating bacon for breakfast? And then we just have a laugh about it. And I'd say, right, well, I'm going to take the chocolate bit from your religion because I want to eat chocolate too. Happy to go without the bacon. But this is just it. Like, it wasn't a big deal as such for a young person growing up in the 80s. It wasn't until later in my life did I actually realise what it meant for the world in Australia to call me Muslim or to label me as Muslim, whether I wanted it or not. So come to like the late 80s, and my father's work transfers him out of Australia, and we actually moved back to Pakistan. And this is complete culture shock, because my sister and I are Aussie kids, we fish fingers and chips, we love Vegemite, and suddenly we're in a country where we can't really speak the language, but we know we're Pakistani because our parents have told us we're Pakistani, and we have ties because we've got grandparents there, but we're also Australian as well. Throughout all of that, what we're trying to retain is the fact that we've got this Muslim thing going for us. And the Muslim thing is a cultural thing, because when we're in Australia, my parents aren't seeking out Pakistanis, they're seeking out people like them. So it didn't really matter whether it was an Indian Muslim or an East African Muslim or an Iranian Muslim. The Muslim thing is what connected my parents. So the cultural tie, didn't have such a big effect or impact. Moved back to Pakistan, and that's when I was about 14 or 15, and I have my first same-sex attracted experience in which I see a beautiful woman on TV watching the Winter Olympics, and I suddenly feel overwhelmed by this incredible passion that I want to set up home with her and marry her and make her my wife. And I'm like 14, and I'm thinking in the same breath, am I nuts? Have I gone crazy? What's going on? Because I know that's not the right feeling, and I know that you don't think like that, and it's not on. And no one even needed to tell me it wasn't on. I just knew, being raised in a heterosexual environment, and in a traditional environment which basically says, right, people are straight, so why would you even think of not being straight? So then became the first of a very long battle in my life to try and repress my sexuality, to try and be straight, to try and seek solace in my faith, to drown myself in religion, to believe then that somehow could make me less gay, to try and do all of those things. I took endless showers as a young child. I feel sad when I turn back and think of myself as a young child, because I really thought I could just, boiling hot water could just burn away the gay. I could suddenly come out of the shower straight again. And if I could go back in time and talk to that young 15, 16-year-old and say, it's not all bad, you will one day be able to share your story, I would rush right now, because they were dark times. I moved back to Australia to start uni when I was 20. And it's a little bit embarrassing, but I lived on campus at Sydney Uni, and to this day I have friends from campus who will say and remind me that apparently I walked around introducing myself, hi, I'm Elena, and I'm bisexual. I did it looking for acceptance. I was looking for, some way of going, all right, now I've come back to Australia, the land of free love, everyone will be fine and open about this, yay. And I wasn't happy. Because living in that queer world, that LGBTIQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer world, yep, and I can do it without a breath. You're very welcome. I wasn't happy because I had to then again repress my spirituality, because all the gays I hung out with were like, why would you want to stay with such an evil faith? I mean, people in your own religion are killing other people. Why do you want to stay there? So then I had to try and push myself away from Islam and say, right, I'm not Muslim. I don't want to be Muslim. Wasn't happy there either. For a very long time, I told myself that I lived a life with a double-edged sword in me. If I tried to be queer, that would stab me, because if I was trying to be Muslim, that would stab me, and there was no chance at all of reconciliation between the two. About 10 years ago, I moved to Canberra. Yes, Canberra. And when I was in Canberra, away from my parents, away from everyone, close to me, trying to start a new life, a new degree there, I went through a process of trying to find myself there yet again. And once again, I tried to reject one in favour of the other, reject the religion, keep the sexuality, again unhappy. Throughout all this process, I had family that was very supportive but very confused by what I was doing, because I'd be announcing one day, I'm queer, you need to march in Pride March, and you need to wear rainbow stickers, and this is what my life is. And they were like, look, that's not us, and you need to just ease up, which is fair enough. But then the next day I'd say, oh my God, I've met the most beautiful boy and I'm in love with him and I'm going to marry him. So they would be like, we can't understand you. And to be honest, and I'm not knocking bisexuality at all, I'm talking about my own world and how I went through a world where I was trying to work myself out until I ended up where I am now. And for me, the big point of loneliness was the fact that in 2004, and don't laugh about this, but if you Googled queer Muslims in Australia, you would not get anything, absolutely nothing. You'd get support groups in England and America and even France, but you'd get nothing in Australia. That's incredibly isolating, because then you start believing that there is no one like you. You are a freak. You are wrong. You shouldn't be that way. You should just be a good Muslim girl, get married, pop out 10 kids. That's what you need to do. So it was really hard for me to stick to what I believed in, which was, yes, my faith is important. It's my spirituality. I'm not psychotic about practicing every single ritual every day, but I am particular about certain things, and it does give me comfort. But at the same time, my sexuality, well, I am a queer woman. I have been with my partner for nearly 10 years now. We have 2 kids. We have a newborn son who is 6 weeks on today, so she's very annoyed I've left to come here right now. But the thing is that my family is, I have made a family. And one of the fears that my parents had years ago, when I basically for the 5 millionth time said, yes, I'm queer and I'm not changing this, I am going to spend the rest of my life with a woman, is that they'd never be grandparents. Well, they are. They have 2 grandsons, not born from me, but part of them. In fact, they have my surname, which is my father's surname, and they are being raised Muslim. My God, trifecta. What more could my dad and mum want? I do feel that the process that I've gone through, and of course I use humour to tell my story, but it has been difficult. And if my story helps even just one Muslim boy or Muslim girl to actually feel that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that you can have 2 halves to one whole, that you can be complete as a queer Muslim person, then I'm really glad that I shared my story. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elena, for sharing your story with us tonight and with us in the anthology. It's quite inspiring and heartfelt. And another inspiring and very heartfelt story comes from Irfan Yusuf, our next speaker. Irfan Yusuf was born in Pakistan and raised in Sydney. He is a lawyer who has worked in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania. He is also an award-winning author. His first book, Once We're Radicals, My Years as a Teenage Islamo-fascist, was published in 2009 and won the I Am Hunger Award for Public Issues Writing. Idvan also writes regularly for newspapers in Australia and New Zealand, including The Age, The Australian, and The Canberra Times. He has been published online at Crikey, New Matilda, The Drum, and Eureka Street. He has appeared on TV and radio in Australia and New Zealand, commenting on religion, politics, education, and sport. Idvan is also a White Ribbon Day ambassador, campaigning to eradicate violence against women and children. In his piece, ABCD, he reflects on the end of a deep friendship that taught him a painful lesson about tradition and belief. Please welcome Irfan.
Thanks very much for coming along, and thank you for that very generous and probably undeserved introduction. Did I write it? Oh, okay. The story is called ABCD, Australian-born confused Desi. And the word Desi is a word that I guess it means someone who can watch Bollywood movies without needing subtitles. Or maybe needs the subtitles, but can understand every second or third word. So that's basically what a Desi is. And I wasn't Australian born. I was born in Pakistan, but I came here when I was about 5 months old. So, yeah, all right, pretty much Aussie. And it was I was confused because I had brown skin, and for me, religion or Islam was only something that I needed to follow as far as my elders were happy with. And the Desi elders that I had above me back in the 1970s were the kind of people who were Muslim the way that their Hindu friends were Hindu, the way that their Sikh friends were Sikh, the way that their Parsi friends were Parsi, etc., etc., etc. Because in those days there was a very small Desi community. So all the Desis stuck together. For example, there was only one spice shop in Sydney in a place called Bondi. And no, it wasn't run by a New Zealander, it was run by an Indian Jew. Yes, there were Indian Jews. We didn't seem to care whether they were Jewish or not. In fact, they looked Muslim to me because the lady wore this sort of scarf type thing, and the bloke had a little cap on his head. So he sort of reminded me of the uncles when they go to the mosque, they put a cap on their head. So that's what it was like. So in the 1970s, we were lower middle class. Being lower middle class actually meant you were quite comfortable, believe it or not, because a lot of people who were lower middle class to middle class could actually afford to buy a holiday house. Many people can't believe this, but it's true. They could actually afford to buy a holiday house. So it was relatively comfortable being a lower middle class person. My father was an academic, so he carried the word doctor, but he wasn't a real doctor, according to the Desi tradition, because a real doctor was someone who had the letters M, B, B and S after their name, and not PhD. So he wasn't a real doctor. And we tended to mix with the sort of the fellow lower middle class people. There were the upper middle class people who were the real doctors, but we didn't we tend to keep it because they would look down upon us. They thought that we were, because our parents sent us to public schools. We couldn't afford to go to Trinity or Sydney Grammar or whatever unless we had a scholarship. And it was only later on what happened is that this is an indication of how important the Desi factor was for my parents and their friends. There was a Pakistani Christian boy who was bullied at his state high school, just down the road from our house actually. And one day he was walking home and some people from his class kicked him and punched him, and he actually died from his injuries. And that caused enormous ruckus among all the Desi parents. So suddenly all these Desi parents decided that, okay, we're going to send our kids to private schools. It had nothing to do with being snobbish or anything. It was just that we didn't want our kids to die. because of course, the Desi educated class were a bit snobbish. They'd say, "Oh, these white people, they're a bit, they don't control their children properly." And, so that's why we've got to send our son to St Andrews, and so so that's what it was all. Now, the fact that it was St Andrews or Trinity Grammar, it didn't matter about religion. The fact that they were an Anglican school, it didn't matter. And as for, questions like, do you go to chapel? Of course you go to chapel. Do you go to divinity? Of course. Don't be extreme. So, so it was really important for us to... But on the other hand, in other areas, our parents were rather extreme because, for example, I would not be able to... I've just decided to go back to uni recently, and I was looking at the O-Week calendar at my university, and it was all about, the beach party and this party and that party. And I could just imagine what would go on at these parties and perhaps after these parties as well. And it's probably not the sort of thing that I would have been allowed to go to when I was young. In fact, my sisters were not even allowed to go to Muslim youth camps because my parents were concerned that, there were boys at these camps and, we've heard things about what goes on at these camps. And, so that was a real issue for me. My dad got really peeved because my mum sent me to a Muslim youth camp. And he said, how can you send him but not the girls? It's not right, But you could not talk to a Desi girl. It was impossible to talk to a Desi girl. Because if you spoke to a Desi girl or if you went out to a movie with a Desi girl, there'd be some kind of gossip or some kind of, what's going on there? And, and the thing was, and every auntie, that's what we call them, every auntie had these antennae that would just rise up, as soon as a guy looked at a girl and was about to say hello, as soon as he was about to say hello or salam, that's it. The salam would go through the antennae first and register before it would actually get to the recipient, the intended recipient. So that's just how it was. It was crazy. And the other crazy thing we had was that we kids, we used to laugh at our elders. We used to laugh at their accents. We used to laugh at the way they dressed. All the uncles wearing safari suits, and whatever. We used to absolutely laugh. And particularly the uncles would insist on, whenever there was a function, they would insist on standing on the podium. They talking on and on and on and on. And, there were kids who were going to uni who could speak English with a perfect, with Aussie accent. But no, the uncle wanted to have his say. On and on and some uncles had really strange sort of hybrid accents. There was one particular uncle who was of Punjabi heritage, and he was married to an Anglo-Australian lady, and so he had a really, he would get up and he was the MC, because in the eyes of the other uncles, he had the most Aussie accent of all. So he would say, "Ladies and gentlemen, can you please take your seats?" Now, it was. Now, it's a bit rude, I know, to talk about this, but that's just how. And the worst thing was we'd have these events like Pakistan Day or Pakistan Independence Day, and what would happen is that we'd have all these young overseas students come from Pakistani overseas students who would come along half tanked, and then they would sort of check out our sisters. And it was all rather disturbing, But of course we would laugh at them. And the irony of the situation is the names we called them were exactly the same as the names we used to get called at school. Mate, you're a fob, aren't you? Chock. You're a choco. Packy, curry muncher. So that's what we would literally superimpose on them the same name. So in a way, we were just as racist as the kids who used to tease us at school. We were just as racist. It's just that we put our racism on another group who we thought was more vulnerable than us. So basically the moral of the story for me after all that, after growing up in that environment, was just keep away from Desies. Too much trouble. Way too much trouble. So I never used to hang around with them. And then one day I get this, I'm talking on Facebook, as you do, and some person comes along with a bloke's name. And says, "Oh, hi, I saw you at this function, blah, 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 let's have a chat." And I'm saying, who are you? And I'm thinking maybe this bloke, I don't know, maybe he's one of those people, maybe he's one of the overseas students from 10 years ago at the Pakistan Day function. But he wasn't, it was actually a she. So then I became very, eventually good friends with this person, and this person had certain issues that I could relate to, such as being very depressed. And then I started learning more and more about what it means to be an overseas student. And believe me, we take a lot of money. Our universities take a lot of money from overseas students. Our country takes a lot of money from overseas students, and we give very little in return. We give very little in return when you've got a person who's alone, very depressed, and because they can't get Medicare, because they can't afford proper treatment, it means the best they can do is go to a counsellor at their university or whatever. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, okay? But some people are so genuinely depressed they need more than that, but they can't afford it. And we don't provide for that. Like I said, I've recently become a student, and I now am enjoying the fact that I can travel half price. It's great. I can not petrol, no, just trains and trams and stuff. But if you're an overseas student, you cannot travel half price. It's full fare, and many people don't realise just how expensive that can be for someone who's paying the full fee as well as the full fare. So later on, I guess it got to a stage where we became good buddies, and then I knew she was getting very depressed, so I called her up to Sydney, and we almost drowned in the beach, and it was all rather crazy. And I think we both probably got some kind of post-traumatic stress, and then we ended up at I think about 3 months later, we went to some restaurant, which is a really conservative Pakistani restaurant called Fahim's Fast Food. You're there because you see a whole line of taxis, but also you see a lot of, students, City Uni art students, who think they're really politically correct by eating. It's a Pakistani restaurant. So anyway, hipsters, I think you call them here. Yes, that's it. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, she's coughing. So anyway, so that's how, and it's a really conservative restaurant. I don't know if any of you have been to restaurants where they actually have rooms out the back where a woman who's fully covered, burqa, everything, can actually sit and eat with her family. I think that's pretty cool, personally, because why should a woman in a burqa be denied the opportunity to eat at a restaurant? But similarly, it just gives an indication as to how conservative the place is. And so, now, if I go up to a friend at school or at uni or whatever these days, everyone, if they're female, if I give them a hug, what's the big deal? No big deal, or if I say, "Oh, hello, how you going?" No worries. But for some reason, my mind went back to 1980-something, sitting among all the aunties, and then this lady puts her arm around me and says, "I'm tired. Oh my God, what are you doing? So now, of course, the other thing I learnt from this particular individual, and this is what all of us kids who, are of Desi heritage, who grew up here have to learn, is that, look, India, Pakistan, they've moved on. Since the time of the aunties, the aunties are no longer there. They're not in Bombay, they're not in Calcutta, they're not in Karachi. They are only here in Australia or New Zealand or whatever. Okay, so everyone there, they're hugging and kissing and you name it. They're doing it all. So we have to understand that's just the reality. But because for us it was so crazy because it was drummed into us, there are certain things you just cannot do with a lady, So therefore, I just and I think that's inevitably what broke up this whole friendship. And I can't say too much about it. Basically, all I can say is buy the damn book and find out for yourself.
Well, thank you, Irfan. That was awesome. Okay, so I'm now here to introduce Tasneem. So Tasneem Chopra studied psychology and international development and has spent 2 decades pursuing social change as a curator, cross-cultural consultant, and TEDx Melbourne alumnus. I got it right. As an Australian Muslim of Indian Kenyan heritage, she has put much energy into conquering stereotypes, particularly as those affect minorities. The Age named her as one of Melbourne's most influential movers and shakers of 2008, whilst in 2009 The Australian listed her as one of 100 emerging leaders. Tasneem sits on various boards, including serving as a chairperson to the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, as well as Lentil as Anything, a community restaurant. She proudly champions the power of a lone voice that is amplified when others listen. And she will now talk about her piece, How I Happened.
Thanks, Amra, team. I think it's pertinent to point out that Desis have the numbers on today's panel. So, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon where we're gathering today. In particular, pay my respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation. I think it's only fitting, given this is an anthology about stories, to acknowledge the true storytellers of this country, whose contribution updates tens of thousands of years. I'm going to present my little bit in a slightly different spin. I'm actually going to read from the book, but that's in no way an indication to not buy it, because I'm going to save. I'm not going to spoil it with the best parts, so you really have to find that out for yourself. Reading through this anthology collective, I was struck by how, despite the author's thread of shared vulnerabilities, it was clear that the capacity to overcome hardships was experienced in various ways that were as varied as the authors themselves. I believe that vignettes of humour and pathos make the intimate insights of each writer here individually endearing. In finding the strength of my difference, I learned that the colour of my skin, my ethnicity, and even my faith could be catalysts in affecting social change. Here, in Coming of Age, I was a storyteller of my narrative, and so began a thrilling chase to see how far I'd come, if at all. My chapter highlights a few crucial points which each played their part in shaping my final outcome, and in some way linked to one another in the most insidious of ways. Journeying back, cliché as it may sound, was both parts cathartic and cringeworthy. Topics of country life, ethnic upbringing, and the human rights injustices that people have faced, youth camps, dressing with flair, these all combined as elements to drive my work today in activism, which until now continues to be a work in progress. To wit, I'd share with you a few excerpts from my chapter, How I Happened, and how this speaks to these markers as they impact upon me one by one. Speaking to country life, Growing up Muslim in country Victoria was a relative non-event in the 1980s. Back then, any hype about Islam had to do with Arabs, Iranians, or flying carpets, none of which I could connect with. I'm a fifth-generation Kenyan of Indian descent, but by any other reckoning, I'm virtually second-generation Australia, considering I arrived here from Kenya, aged 4. I had a typically Australian country childhood in Bendigo, 2 hours north of Melbourne. During summer holidays, we went bike riding, borrowed VHS movies from our neighbours, made icy poles from orange juice, and caught yabbies in the creek at the local park. Speaking into my ethnic upbringing, I wrote, "As a child, I was generally more conscious of my Indianness than my Muslimness. There was a sizable Indian community in town, upward of 30 families, who set up the Indo-Australia Club, of which my family were loyal members. My immersion in ethnic life comprised many weekend and after-school session of Indian dance classes, learning Hindi songs. I boasted a repertoire of 12 songs at one stage. Monthly or bi-monthly functions at the local YMCA, where families and children would showcase these talents. We looked quite the cultural fusion, with our broad Aussie accents, donning traditionally coloured dancing skirts and blouses embroidered in mirrors and sequins. We spun, tapped our feet, and gracefully clinked our bangles about, all the while focusing on the promise of a McDonald's cheeseburger and milkshake on the way home. As I progressed into adolescence, I recall discovering injustice. These issues until then had not been as salient as they are to me now than they were then. I remember in Year 9, at a school assembly, an Australian band called Goanna. They performed their iconic hit, Solid Rock, with lyrics that proclaimed the white law had lied. I was stunned. Here was an alternative retelling of the Indigenous past that had contradicted what we had been taught about Australian history. Solid Rock planted the seeds of activism in my heart, and it dawned on me that the state could actually be complicit in inflicting injustices and get away with it. So began my moral outrage, which would last me well into the future. I also recall, on a side note, being very passionate about injustices occurring overseas, and I remember specifically reading Steve Biko's bio, the South African activist. My passions for social justice, paired with my fierce inability to have any navigational drive, resulted in me attending, or wanting to attend, the first ever anti-apartheid rally in Bendigo, but not being able to find the rally in a country town with 4 main streets. And while I couldn't find the rally, I did find my voice, and I realised that that's what I wanted to pursue, a foray into justice, however long it would take me. Segueing into the adolescent world of identity and image consciousness, I recall how these passions collided when attending my first Muslim youth camp as a teenager in my formative years. These experiences revealed a heady mix of pubescent sass and surprising wisdom. Where are we? For my first camp, I packed the requisite tracksuit, runners, and practical outdoorsy attire. By the second camp, there was a shift. I always believed that what I lacked in height, I had to compensate for with individual flair. This meant stylised outfits that were colour-coordinated with accessories that had just the right amount of summertime glamour. This was the 1980s. The look was all about big and bright, including hairstyles held in place with ridiculous amounts of hair product. I spent an unnatural amount of time selecting outfits for each camp, often weeks before it started. Accessories were pre-selected, sometimes months before. I didn't mess around with the wardrobe department. Despite the fact that girls were required to wear hijabs, the creative blend of big fringes and puffy hairdos that strategically perched under your scarf, or more often than not flowed outside of it, became a coveted art form. Dress codes were no deterrent for fashionista warriors. The bling was glitzy and loud. Portable shoulder pads were my secret weapon. A typical outfit comprised of a long flowing skirt, oversized shirt, shoulder pads, large belt worn on the hips with the shirt puffing over, cuffs neatly folded back to reveal massive metal bangles, huge loop earrings and stilettos. Some might argue I haven't come too far, but my efforts weren't in vain, as I recall one year taking out an actual award commending me for participation in camp activities while wearing heels. I took part in archery, kayaking and volleyball in skirts and wedge sandals. My efforts were hampered by my fabric that got caught in equipment, which cost my team valuable points, and yes, it slowed down my game, but I still went to collect my awards as the sparkle of bling reflected in camera flashes. I was the diva of camp. My camp friends were second-generation ethnics like me. We gelled despite our different cultural labels. I grew up at a time when there was no Islamic primary or secondary schools. There were no weekend madrasas or Sunday schools. All of a sudden, I went from being a kid in a country town in Australia with only occasional exposure to Islamic events to being surrounded by Muslims 24/7. Now, nearly every camp attendee I knew was struck by a halal romance, a tricky journey in which the halal and the hormone frequently collided. Palpitations of the heart, yes, P-O-T-H-Y, pothy, became the code name ascribed to a particular guy who literally got the heart racing of any girl. I can't say. Of any girl in my cohort of cabin friends. After the evening prayers and lectures concluded, we'd retire to our cabins and neglect sleep. We'd compile lists of famous movie stars and pop stars that we believed topped the potty charts. My list typically included David Bowie, Scott Baio, Ivor Davies, Simon Le Bon. But on reflection at the possibility of ever realising a future with said celebrity pothy, we deployed a more workable interpretation. If you had to marry a guy at this camp, who would it be? And really, who are we kidding? This was the whole point of the pothy exercise from the get-go. Fortunately, no two girls ever listed the same pothy, which would have been catastrophic, and the secrecy of the pothy code was crucial. No one ever shared knowledge of a friend's pothy to another person outside the cabin. It was secret women's business of the pubescent kind, charged with the vows of foreverness. Yes, there were shared elements of feeling difference from the mainstream growing up in Australia, due to markers of race, gender, faith or culture. Clearly, the settlement experience of second and third generation migrants comprises a smorgasbord of stories that make for great reading and conversation, as we've already witnessed with Looking for Ali Brandy, or Does My Head Look Big in This, or Unpolished Gem, and now add to that coming of age. My experience in contributing to this story was to invest in some honest reflection about the nuances that gave rise to the person I am today. And this exercise has made me very grateful for my difference, because it's allowed me to embrace my wins and losses in the greater context of growth. To conclude, I would read, as a public speaker today, when I stand before an audience to speak about demystifying Islam, the presumptions about me are rampant. Who am I? Do I speak English? Am I oppressed? Do I wear my hijab in the shower? Some appear honestly stunned hearing me speak, unable to reconcile my accent with my skin colour or my funky headscarf. I've been wearing the hijab since university and never once in the shower. And my penchant for bling and colourful hijabs has lent itself to a world of interpretation. Am I a gypsy, an African, an Arab, a tourist? I take great delight in introducing myself as an Australian Muslim who is fifth generation East African of ultimately Indian origin, watching many facial expressions in the audience register my exotic credentials. But when I follow that with a swift, but I was raised and grew up in country Victoria, Bendigo, there's a combined lack of surprise and disappointment as the myths come crashing down. I wouldn't trade my Australian story upbringing for anything. Bush dancing, Hindi songs, debutante balls and yappy catching, through to the pothy dramas of youth camps, have forged to create a complex me. I carry a Muslim identity that is simultaneously Aussie, Indian, Kenyan, inquisitive, optimistic, defiant, and frequently fallible. This is how I happened. Thank you.